Hey everyone, welcome to You Said What, where we look at the most memorable conversations and written interchanges in our lives. First off, I want to thank our sponsor, Pioneering Collective, an executive thought leadership firm combining personal PR, coaching, and networking to transform hard-earned wisdom into heavyweight impact. You can learn more at pioneeringcollective.com. Today's guest is Cesar Samayoa. He's an actor, and he's currently on the Broadway show Come From Away. It's a really moving story about this little town in Newfoundland that has about 7,000 people, and they hosted another about 7,000 people, all out-of-towners who were in airplanes during 9/11 and whose pilots were told that they needed to immediately land because they shut the skies down. And so all these 36, 37 planes were directed to this little town called Gander in Newfoundland. And so you have a town of 7,000, suddenly had 7,000 more people. And it's an amazing story about the relationships that developed in this town. In this episode, Cesar talks about a conversation that he had with one of the real-life people that he plays in the show. Hope you enjoy the conversation with him.
Hey,
Cesar.
Ernie, how are you?
I'm great. It's so good to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
We had a date to do this before, and then you had to do an emergency fill-in for, I think, another actor who was out, and such is life on Broadway.
Exactly. We have all kinds of rehearsals all the time. This is a very specific time with everything that's happening with COVID right now.
I can't imagine doing a show almost every day and twice on some days for years now. It must be a totally and then as you said, COVID on top of it, it must be a totally grueling process.
You know, it's a different form of athleticism, I've been told, and I completely agree with it. Your mind has to focus in a totally different way to be able to do this.
Thank you for taking time. And I, of course, saw your show Come From Away and loved it. I feel like I'm like a walking advertisement, one of those like I laughed, I cried, kind of like things you see on the marquee, but it's really true. It was like, it took you through all these emotional swings, and it was just so thoughtful and beautiful, and I loved it. And obviously I'm far from alone. People are raving and raving about it. It must have been a cool experience to be part of it.
It's been one of those life-changing experiences, and I always hear that it's the perfect musical for people who don't like musicals. It is pretty down to earth. It has incredible kind of rock Celtic sounds to it, and the story touches everyone's soul, so it's really something special.
I want to talk about your conversation, your meeting, and getting to know one of the real life characters in the show. You play a guy named Kevin who has a partner named Kevin too. There's two Kevins. You play one of the Kevins, and the whole show, I should say, it's all portraying real people, real passengers on the planes, real residents of Gander. Tell us a little bit about how you got introduced to the real Kevin.
Absolutely.
When it was and what happened.
Yeah, of course. I was developing this show called Come From Away, this brand new show in a beautiful theater in Southern California in La Jolla called La Jolla Playhouse. And no one knew if there was any kind of future for this show or if it would resonate at all. We started our developmental process and we had our first preview, and it became very clear that the show had a life ahead of it. And we finished that run. It was a developmental run, a couple of weeks in La Jolla. I got back to New York, and in the middle of the night, I get an email notification. I happen to be checking emails, and I opened my inbox, and there's an email sitting there that said, "Hi, my name's Kevin, and I think you play me in a musical."
That is so funny.
I'm still kind of in shock. I'm actually holding the email right now in my hand, and I haven't read it, in years at this point. And it's something I'll never forget, that moment of my jaw dropped and saying, I've been looking for this guy, and I can't wait to hear his story.
So what did he say in the email?
If you'll allow me to read this first sentence,
please.
It's a lengthy email, but I'll just read this first sentence that kind of sets it off. I just this minute found out about Come From Away for the first time. From the scant information I've been able to glean from reading your rave reviews, it looks like your character, Kevin, is based upon me. Kevin Turf was my partner of 17 years, and yes, it's true. My name is Kevin too.
Wow. And so, and he goes on and he talks a little bit, he's a little concerned about how he's portrayed in the show, right?
Well, right. From where the show was in La Jolla, this whole kind of character trajectory was from the perspective of his ex-boyfriend, his ex-partner, Kevin Turf. There wasn't really much to go on for the Kevin Young character, Kevin J character that I...
Could you not get in touch with him, or he just didn't...
I don't think the team was able to get in touch with him. I think they were able to get in touch with Kevin Turf, And there was definitely an interesting story there between the two of them, and they couldn't get in touch with him. So it was very much entirely from Kevin Turf's perspective at that point. But what this allowed is our team met up with him, and kind of the whole life of this character changed dramatically from that moment going forward.
So the part changed after you heard from your Kevin.
Yeah,
is that right?
Part changed significantly.
Your portrayal of it, or the lines, or everything?
The depth of the character, the storyline completely changed. There was more from his perspective, his life, what he was going through in Gander, and it completely changed. I mean, he now a significant part of the story. I'm just so honored to be playing it, and I can't believe it all started from this email.
Anything else in the email that you want to share? So he hit this moment where he was a little trepidatious. He thinks he's got the guy who plays him. He kind of wants he's poking around. He wants to find out how you play him. And it sounds like it's a long letter. Any other pieces of it that you want to share?
Yeah, I would love to share how he ended this email. And again, this is the first time he contacted me. The last line says, "It's very hard to explain, but the mere thought of those beautiful, selfless, nurturing people and the wonderful and astonishing memories of the few days we spent with them will be with me and cause me both to smile and weep for the rest of my life. Cordially, Kevin Young."
Fantastic. So if he had never gotten in touch with you, his role would be really different.
It would be really different.
Like.
I think in La Jolla, I might have had 4 lines, and you've seen the show at this point, and the two Kevins have a beautiful storyline. They're one of the few characters with a definite beginning, middle, and end in this story, because we portray so many characters in this show. But they're one of the lucky few that you kind of see the trajectory.
I guess we should say now, spoiler alerts, if I'm going to ask some questions about plot lines, so maybe I'll just get that out of the way. But the two Kevins, I think you mentioned, there's an interesting piece of their story, which is that there's some tension, but they come in, they're in a relationship when they land, and then there's some tension between them there. And it becomes a little complicated. And so it's not a typical relationship where everything's peachy keen before and after. And so you can understand why your Kevin would be a little concerned if the other Kevin was doing the narrating, what he would come out looking like.
Absolutely.
Was the original version sort of heavily skewed? Did your Kevin come out seeming like a little bit like the bad guy in the original version, or not?
I actually wouldn't say that he came out looking like the bad guy, but there was not much to his story. He had maybe 2 or 3 kind of sassy laugh lines or retorts, and there wasn't much to it. You didn't really see what that character was, what Kevin J, my character, was going through. You didn't see where he was in the world. I mean, I think this is a good time to mention that this musical takes place the week after 9/11, when these 38 planes landed in this little town called Gander, Newfoundland. The town doubled in size, and people opened their doors from people all over the world. And it's really quite an astonishing story about kindness. And what I love about my character is that he's a New Yorker, and all he thinks about is getting back to his family in New York. So he was having a very different type of experience there. And you see it play out in this relationship.
Yeah, it's really understandable how his mind's back in New York. So all this kindness is going on in Gander, and people are taking advantage of it and settling into it. And he has trouble settling into it, not because he's a bad guy, just because he's anxious and worried about what's going on back at home. And so it made me think I was in Hong Kong during 9/11. And so there's a part of you you're kind of a little bit relieved that you're not in New York when it's being attacked by terrorists, but you also kind of feel like you should be there. You feel a little guilty about not being there. And I don't know if that's what Kevin was feeling, but it sounds like he was more than anything just concerned about his friends and his family and things like that. But he stands out because he's having trouble accepting and settling into this warmth of the locals.
Exactly. Very much having a hard time putting aside what is happening in the world, because it was a devastating time. I can only remember for myself. I immediately grouped together with my family, and all we did was watch those TVs 24/7 during that entire time, especially those first couple of weeks. So I very much understand this perspective from this character.
So he ultimately came and saw the show. Were you a little nervous about what he'd think about it, given that he had reached out to you with this long email?
I was terrified. Our second stop in the show was in Seattle, and we were about to open the show, and Kevin Young was coming to see it, and we made a point to have dinner before he came to see the show. And he came and he was a nervous wreck, and I was a nervous wreck. He very rightly was concerned about what he was about to watch, his life kind of on stage. And then we just settled into dinner, and he started telling me all these stories, all these kind of incredible stories about his time in Gander, Newfoundland. And specifically starting with stories of being on an airplane for 28 hours on the tarmac before they were allowed out, and what transpired on that airplane. And he started telling me stories of the passengers around him and how he reacted to them and what he and Kevin were doing on that plane. And he didn't know that almost every single story that he told me, he was about to see on stage, dramatized. Almost every single story that he told me was a major point in one of the songs in the show. And I didn't tell him, but I did. I kept nodding. I kept feigning surprise, knowing that this was about to transpire. And the theater was really small. So we speak directly to the audience. So I had a really good eye-to-eye contact with him almost throughout the entire performance. And it was astonishing to see his reaction of what was happening.
What did he say after the show?
We have another character in the show called Captain Beverly Bass. And she happened to be in the audience that night as well. And they sat them right next to each other. And all I remember is the two of them almost physically holding each other at the curtain call and just bawling. And of course, that makes us completely lose it as well. So we were just all a crying mess at that point. And he couldn't believe it. And going forward, he said friends and family come in and all of them say the same thing. Like, I can't believe how they just nailed this, how they nailed his kind of spirit, his personality, his humor. And that goes right to our writers and these interviews that they did with our real people.
That's pretty hard to do because you often hear about usually when it's a real life story, somebody's complaining about how they were portrayed, if not multiple people. Pretty amazing that people feel like you nailed it and people are just swept away by the emotions. There's no complaints about, you got this wrong, or I'm not quite like that, or that's unusual.
Yeah, it's very unusual, but we had 2 years of development, which is very rare, in 3 different theaters. And our team really went through great lengths to make sure that everyone was very much honored and very true to who they were as they could be.
Do you stay in touch with the Kevin?
Absolutely. We stay in touch. We text, we email, we go out when he's here in New York. We were at Marie's Crisis one night singing show tunes at the piano bar. He's become an incredible friend. It's someone that we keep on touching base. And I also noticed this, Ernie. I've been dying to tell you. For the first time, I looked at the date of this email, and it's September 11th, 2015, that he emailed me. And our show obviously has to deal with September 11th. So it's an unbelievable way.
Was that a total coincidence or was he waiting?
Coincidence. I think knowing Kevin, it was a total coincidence. I think he just found out. Maybe something came out in the press because it was September 11th and he opted to email me right then and there.
When we were talking about this before, you had called this a 9/12 musical instead of a 9/11 musical. Why is that distinction important to you?
Because we don't. The show takes place in Gander, Newfoundland, right? Very far away from New York City. And while the tragedy that happened in New York and Washington, D.C., and really around the world almost frames our show, it is not about 9/11. It's about how this community opened its doors and their hearts to the world because of 9/11. And it really takes place those 5 days after 9/11. It's a show about the strength of the human spirit and also what can happen when we all come together. It's a message that I think we just so desperately need right now.
Yeah, it's funny. You're talking about kindness, and I felt like after watching this, somebody should launch a global kindness project or something where everybody just tries to be as kind as they can be for a day and to see what would happen. Because it's like there's, as you say, this town of 6,000 people, 7,000 people, and everybody seems like they're being kind. On a global scale, that's relatively small, but you see a kind of microcosm of what can happen, how it can totally transform people, a setting, people's trajectories, all kinds of things. Like experiment in that has that kind of power. It made you think like, my God, if you could do this, if you could just replicate this, say 5 other places or something, what would that catapult? Do? It's so interesting.
I mean, the show, I think the message from the show has taught me viscerally that the smallest act of kindness can really change your life. Because that's what these people did. It wasn't this kind of massive gesture. It was making sandwiches for people and making sure they were comfortable and making sure people had their basic needs and someone to talk to. And it makes me think of what a smile can do when you're passing someone on the street, or what opening a door for someone can do, or what paying for someone's coffee, how that can set off a chain reaction throughout the day that can really uplift so many people. I think about it every day. And it's funny that you bring up kind of acts of kindness, because this show has really started so many different projects. And that kind of reverberate around the world at this point, scholarships. And in the show, we talk about on the plane ride back from Gander, one of the passengers started a scholarship for students in Gander, Newfoundland. And now we've met dozens of these recipients from these scholarships that were started by the plane people. That's what the people who were not from Gander were called. Kevin Turef talks about at his company, he would give $100 to every employee on 9/11 to go out and do a random act of kindness. And now our show does that, and it happens all around the world on 9/11. We very much use it as a day of service. So this message is very much going forward on a daily basis.
You have this small town of 6,000 people, and then you have all these people from, presumably a lot of people from bigger cities, 36, 7 planes worth of people drop in. And so you have like the potential for a sort of big city, small town kind of clash. But that's not at all what happens. And what do you think was what cut through potential for different sensibilities? Again, people flying all over the world, people doing, caught up in their business world or whatever, dropping into this little place that they had never even heard of, couldn't even pick it off a map. But everybody got along really well. What do you chalk that up to?
I mean, if you remember that time, we wanted to help each other out in any way we could. And I think what it's taught me is that I think at our core, just as human beings, we truly just want to help each other out. And this was an opportunity where they saw tragedy, people in need, and people in desperate need for help. And the community just banded together and did what they felt was right. And I think of what happened in New York that week after 9/11. People lining up and down the highway to hand off socks and T-shirts and food and anything you could imagine for the people down at Ground Zero. It was an amazing time of a community of an entire city like Manhattan coming together, and to see that kind of portrayed in such in a tiny way in this little town in Gander, it's really special.
You've had a lot of 9/11 victims, people who were in the buildings during 9/11, and other people who were really close to the action and the tragedy, lost people. You've had a lot of those people over the years, 5 years or so, right, now that the show's been on, come and see the play and the musical. And they've also had an amazing reaction to it, it sounds like, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think of my brother-in-law is in the New York City Fire Department. He was down at Ground Zero in the rubble for months and months. He never spoke about 9/11. And he came to see the show in Seattle. And he told me he finally had a different version of that day in his head. That's the version that we all know was seared in his head, obviously.
Right.
But he finally had a different version of that day where goodness and human kindness were at the forefront rather than evil and tragedy. And he started talking about his experience there. And that has happened over and over again with every kind of person that you could imagine that is connected with 9/11 from the show.
You told me that story of somebody who gave you their office badge or pass, right? Tell that story.
We were, I think, in our first week of previews at the Schoenfeld Theater for Broadway. And I saw this woman come when we were, before the pandemic, we had a massive kind of stage door crowd after the show. And it was very different from most shows because it really wasn't about, please, can I have your autograph? It was people saying, thank you, and also sharing their 9/11 stories with us. It felt very different. And I kind of clocked this woman once or twice, and it was only the first and second week of previews, so we had just started. And I left the theater one night, and I felt the tap on my shoulder, and she started talking to me, and she said, I don't know why I want to do this. She's like, but this is my ID. I worked in the World Trade Center, and I got out that day, and I want you to have this. It's still it's up in my dressing room. It's one of my most cherished memories from that time. And I also realize it's become something that people are doing. I have badges from police officers. I have ID cards from a detective from that time. I have this woman's ID from the World Trade Center. And I think it's almost a gesture of letting go, of finally letting that tragedy go as much as we all can, and opening your heart up for just a little bit of goodness from that time.
It may also speak to your distinction between 9/12 and 9/11. People want this to be this beautiful lasting image that comes out of it. Of course, there was the tragic piece, but there's the beautiful piece that, as you say, maybe it was harder to focus on at the time, but you guys have helped popularize and spread, and maybe people really want to associate themselves with that, and because it is so moving.
And I think maybe it might have to do with the two characters that I portray. I play both of my characters happen to be people who don't want to be there. They so desperately want to be home because that's what they're thinking about, their families and everything back home. Not that they don't appreciate the kindness that's happening around them. But I would be that person. If it was me at that time in our history in this beautiful little town, and the world was being kind to me, I would still be thinking in my head, how do I get back home to my family?
You felt like as you were playing this role that you too would, like the Kevin that you play, would have trouble settling in. You'd just be, part of you would be stuck back in New York.
Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind. Yeah. There's no doubt in my mind.
Just mention, because you alluded to it, mention the other character that you play.
I play Ali, who is an Egyptian chef who is Muslim, and he starts to deal with some anti-Muslim rhetoric and feelings within his time there. And that has been quite an honor to play, because along with the people that I've been mentioning, like firefighters and police officers, I've had families come in who are Muslim and approach me after the show and said, thank you, I finally see myself portrayed on stage. I finally see what I had to go through at that time, the suspicion. And
so the people who were immediately subject to new kinds of discrimination, they see that.
And surprisingly, we have a lot of students come to the show. I've had really young kids and teenagers say, I never knew what my parents went through. They would talk about it, but I never fully understood what they went through. So thank you for showing me and opening my eyes to how my parents' lives changed almost in an instant from that day.
Have you also had conversations with him?
I have not met Ali. And Ali, I know, is some of our characters are kind of 3 or 4 people put together. And I have not met the gentleman that this is based on.
You also went back and performed this show back in Gander in the hockey rink. Sounds like it was like a big concert. You know, having seen the show, everybody in Gander seems so down to earth and humble that I half imagine them saying like, what's the big deal? Why'd you do this big show about us? But it sounds like it was a very emotional experience for them too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Broadway is the dream, but as far as Come From Away is concerned, the Gander concert is the event that kind of changed our lives going forward. It was our way of asking permission to take their story and bring it to New York. So we did the concert for 2,000 people in the ice hockey rink, which was almost the entirety of the town. And I'll never forget, we were backstage and we all huddled together like, okay, we have to keep it together. We have to keep it together. It's going to be all right. Let's do this show for this community and get their permission to go forward with it. And we started the show, and one of our first lines is "Welcome to the Rock." And we said, "Welcome to the Rock," and the entire place just jumped up and screamed. And of course, we just all broke down and started crying. And that was...
You had to take like a 10-minute break.
We had to take like a 10-minute break. And that was the first 10 seconds of the show already. Every person, every character that was introduced, you'd say, this is Beulah. And Beulah would be sitting in the first or second row. And the entire place knew who she was. And they would all scream. So there was entrance applause for every character. All the mayors that we talk about were there. They jumped up on stage to dance with us at the end. I will never, ever forget it.
Wow. So like the whole town, literally the whole town.
The whole town was there. The entirety of the town was there. And we talk about the ice hockey rink becoming the world's largest refrigerator as more and more food was brought to Gander to feed this population that doubled. So there we were in the world's largest refrigerator performing the show of this community. And it's astonishing.
And there's also been some lasting relationships built with people there between some of the actors and some of the real life people. All kinds of relationships all around.
Almost every single person that is portrayed in the show has become a dear friend, really family member. I mean, they have been with us through this journey. From day one, we have seen people experience their lives being theatricalized in such a beautiful and honest way. And we've seen what happens, the inspiration that happens because of it. These are people that are going to be lifelong friends forever, way after I'm done performing Come From Away at the Schoenfeld.
That's quite the legacy. Yeah. This is a podcast about communication. Were there other elements of communication that the way things were done that led the relationships that developed the communications to be so smooth and profound in this case?
I think what really made everything work was the openness that everything was approached with. There was no other option other than to basically open your heart up and do what needs to be done. So many times, I'll find myself stopping myself from doing something, and this community could not do that and did not do that. And in turn, the people that felt stranded there also could not stop themselves because they so desperately needed help. So a beautiful, almost instant rapport started happening between the people that were stranded and the people that lived in these communities. You don't find that. Like, we're New Yorkers, Ernie. We walk down the street and you hardly look at someone in the eye. Forget about talking to them and opening your front door to let them into your house or apartment. And this was the exact opposite there. If someone was going out for a walk on the street because they wanted to take some air, someone would pull over and say, "Can I take you somewhere?" If someone needed a toothbrush, someone would say, "I'll go get one for you at the drugstore, or come with me. Let's go get it together and let's find out about each other's lives." There's an openness that just that's really hard to come by these days. And I think you do find it in smaller towns. I find myself working in smaller towns somehow, and someone says hello to me out of nowhere, and I'm almost shocked. I almost become defensive, like, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" But that was not the case here. And look what happened because of that. Look what happened because people were simply took their guards down and were open with each other and tried to find out what another person's experience was.
So well said, Caesar. Thanks so much for coming on and talking about this show. I love the show, and I loved getting a chance to dissect it with you. Super moving.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Ernie. This has been just awesome.
I'm really not a musical guy. I'm the person that when someone says, like, we should go see this musical, I'm like, I don't know. I think I have plans. I don't dislike them. I just don't usually love them. And just as Caesar said, that this musical is a musical for people that don't usually like musicals. I love this show, and I've been telling everyone about it. It's really amazing the range of emotions you experience during this couple-hour performance. Definitely get choked up. You definitely laugh a lot. It's, I think, uncommon for a show to really affect people in the way that this has. It's clearly, you can tell from listening to Caesar talk about it, it's changed a lot of lives. And the message on some level is kind of cliche. It's about little acts of kindness. But when you see what's happened as a result of it, it really does, cliche or not, it makes you realize how important those little acts of kindness are. And it's hard not to come out of it thinking, I gotta try to do a few more of those little acts of kindness myself. If you've got a cool communications experience that had a big impact on you, email me. I'd love to feature you on the show. And if you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe to You Said What. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week.